Hello and welcome to Viewpoints in Depth. My name is Bijan Karimi and with me today is Tom Davis, Chief of Police from Lynnwood, Washington, and we're going to be talking about countering violent extremism. Welcome, Tom, and thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Participants in the NPS program come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Tell me a little bit about yours and how you got to your thesis topic.
So I've spent about 30 years in local law enforcement. That's my background. And when I came to NPS, what I wanted to do was have a research topic that was much broader than the local lexicon and be able to look at something more national, something that was outside of perhaps my comfort zone as well.
So what was it that drew you to CHDS?
What drew me to CHDS was the desire to actually spend time with people from other disciplines, just what you just spoke to about the variety of disciplines that are here, and being able to spend time in a like-minded environment and discuss topics that were really outside of what I had learned or been engaged in my 30 years in law enforcement.
Your thesis focuses on countering violent extremism, CVE. In order to study it, you went and looked at what is going on in the United Kingdom as well as Australia and kind of compared that to the US. What were some of the research findings you had?
So some of the research findings were that there are some parallels between essentially Western democratic countries, and that's why I needed to use them as comparative models. In the United States, after 9/11, for example, which tends to be the event in which has triggered a lot of conversation around terrorism, for better or for worse, quite frankly, we wanted to see what the United States had been doing. And it took the United States literally 10 years to develop any kind of actionable CVE strategy. Yet in the United Kingdom and Australia, shortly after 2001, they both implemented CVE strategies. And so I wanted to look at what they did, the purpose behind them, and what really was the community engagement that they were focusing on that I thought would be something that we could utilize and implement here in the United States.
So you zeroed in on community engagement. Is that one of the areas that they may have done better than we do?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so what in particular were the things that you learned?
So as I broadened my view and became international in my research, what I really ultimately found is that it does come back home to the local level. And so one of the things United Kingdom was doing was, many people are familiar with their prevent strategy, but embedded within their prevent strategy is a program called Channel. It's a community-based program that they engage with local stakeholders in their communities, not just law enforcement, it's not just government. And then in Australia, they implemented a Building Communities of Resilience program, a grant block program, and again, embedding the conversation very locally within the community and the stakeholders in the community from all different disciplines, and not just a federally implemented program or a state-run program.
In your work, and you just alluded to this, you talk about the concept of working with the community. You introduce this idea of social capital. What is it, and how does it relate to countering violent extremism?
So social capital, my perspective on that, and the reason I use that term is because what we're doing in our countering violent extremism or anti-terrorism campaign is we are trying to harden infrastructure. We talk a lot about infrastructure protection, protecting capital. But what I think is as important, if not more important, is investing in social capital, the relationship building in communities. And by doing the relationship building in communities, we actually can really harden ourselves against catastrophic events, whether they be man-made or natural.
So tell me more about establishing definitional clarity around this idea of countering violent extremism.
So definitional clarity was an issue that I found in my research. As far back as the 1980s in the United States, there was over 100 definitions of terrorism itself. The term terrorism is a largely pejorative term now, very negative in context. The term radical is oftentimes deemed to be a very pejorative term as well. And so what we find is that we tend to look at the negative when we look at these terms. Understanding the terms is very important. So what I found in my research is that the definitions were not clear in any of the US strategies at all, that we need to talk about those definitions every time we're engaging in a document or policy implementation.
When there is no clarity in what the definition is, you also have many different organizations that seem to jump in and be involved at the federal level. In your thesis, you also make a recommendation that there should be one agency that's taking the lead?
Yeah, and in my research, I also found that at the federal level at the time, many organizations had bits and pieces of CVE embedded within their operation. And one of my recommendations is that the Countering Violent Extremism program, those programmatic strategies, be embedded under one responsibility within the federal government.
5 different recommendations came out of your thesis. Tell me a little bit about the concept of definitional clarity.
So what I found in my research is that several of the documents in the United States have either no definition for terms that are used, or the terms are ambiguous at best. And one of my recommendations about clarity with terms is that we define what the term means within the document, because if we don't, then what happens is we leave it to the reader to fit their narrative. And many of these terms can be very pejorative in nature, and so what we want to do is make sure that we at least agree on what we're saying when we use the term within the document.
And when there's confusion among the term, different federal agencies can be involved, which leads to one of your other recommendations, which is
that several agencies not be involved in CVE programmatic strategy, that in fact one agency be involved at the federal level.
And do you make a recommendation as to which agency that would be?
I do not. I think that it's best that decision lie with the federal government. But the fact is, when we have local agencies like myself looking to engage in support or kits to help us implement strategies locally, we're not sure where to communicate or who to interact with.
Another recommendation you have is really separating out what the federal government's role should be in this concept of countering violent extremism versus what the local role should be. And you mentioned support versus actually kind of being on the ground. Tell me about that.
So what I found in the U.S. strategy that we had in place was that they also wanted to engage at the federal level locally. One of my recommendations is that the federal government not engage locally, but rather provide support for local engagement to local authorities and local communities. And that ties in particularly well with my belief, my theory that local communities should be engaged in community trust building on the ground with the people that are there every day. I'm in my community every day. My officers are in the community every day. Our faith-based leaders in our community every day. Those are the people that we want to engage in locally. It's difficult to develop relationships and teams, if you will, when we have people that aren't engaged every day.
In a Medium post, you wrote about the importance of investing, and you just said you and your officers are investing in the community, spending their time every single day. With that investment, and getting back to the idea of social capital, what has the return on investment been?
I believe in Lynnwood anyway that the return has been excellent. What we're doing in Lynnwood is we're trying to engage locally and also not just have it be a one-way dialogue with conversation with the groups that we built, but also have it be two-way and provide information back to them as well. Make it worth their time to be engaged with us and make sure that those relationships are developed ahead of critical events or critical incidents, because that's the social capital that we want to develop and we want to build upon in our community.
With any type of research, a thesis or otherwise, it's one thing to talk about it, and it's entirely different to actually do it. So which of these things have you implemented in your own community? What was the catalyst for it, and what have the results been?
Again, when I started my research, I wanted to go much broader than my local experience. And the broader I went, the more I realized that it was actually the local connections that were most important. And so what we've done in Lynnwood, for example, is we've engaged in what we call a cops and clergy program, where we bring faith-based leaders from all denominations together, and we sit down with them and we provide training to them. We give them some value in being together as well with us, and we develop those relationships. And that's important too, because they also have some of the same challenges within their faith-based communities that we have in our community as a whole. They're dealing with members of their faith-based organization that are dealing with drug addiction or domestic violence issues or concerns about their children being on the internet. So it isn't a one-way information exchange where we're just extrapolating or pulling information from them, but we're actually engaging and providing them something of value as well.
And when you were introducing this concept to the community, how did you go about it, and how did they receive it?
The reception has been overwhelming. What I found in our community is that many of the faith-based organizations, particularly the Jewish, Sikh, and Muslim communities, wanted to partner in our community and provide some sort of service. And so they kept individually coming to us and saying, what can we do, what can we do? And what we found is that bringing them all together will allow us to leverage that resource to actually allow them to do something as a group together, an interfaith group. and it's been very well received.
Your research was cited in a 2016 report to the Homeland Security Advisory Committee about countering violent extremism. Who else has been picking up on your research, and what's the result been?
I'm not sure who else nationally has been picking up on the research itself. I do know that the topic of CVE is a very relevant topic and one that's in the lexicon and the federal government right now. I'm thankful that they picked up the recommendations from my thesis and are looking to implement them. Ultimately, what will happen, I believe, is that it will enable us locally to engage in a more robust and meaningful way with the groups in our community to help counter any violence in our community. Sometimes when we attach the word extremism to it, we tend to move it into a very narrow category. And I think what's important is the things that we've learned are that whether it's violence from terrorism, violence from any other issue in our community, to control that and to fight that is the most important issue.
And one of the big pieces is being out in the community, engaging with others so that the narrative that someone else may be creating or the words that are being used aren't somehow clouding the issue of community policing, being part of the community, and developing that social capital when something does happen so that you can draw on it.
Absolutely, absolutely right. In fact, when we first began developing our Cops and Clergy program and reaching out, one of the first places we reached out to was one of our local mosques and the faith-based leaders there in the mosque. And originally, we even met away from the mosque, that didn't necessarily want to meet at the mosque. And so we started to develop that relationship, small meetings, one-on-one, explaining what the Cops and Clergy program was about, why we wanted to develop it. And what that led to was the ability, an invitation to actually go speak at the mosque and talk about some of our policy change and our Safe Spaces initiative that we've engaged in our community, and speaking directly to the members there. One of the things we've talked about in my address to the mosque was that we're looking at ways to create a more diverse workforce in our community. And so one of the policy changes that I implemented was to allow religious headwear in the Lynnwood Police Department for very specific faith-based members. And so that was very significant. It doesn't mean that we're reducing any standards for hiring, any requirements, or any qualities that we're looking for in a member. But if we're excluding members of our community that would otherwise be excellent police officers, why would we not allow them to represent our organization in that way? And that also was very well received. And that, again, is just part of the trust building in our community that we're looking to do in Lynnwood.
Mm-hmm. A little bit about the CHDS experience. Were there any particular classes or instructors that were super helpful in getting you to put your thesis research together?
Yeah, there was. The comparative governments course in particular was one I found much interest in. That led me to asking Nadav Morag, Dr. Morag, to be one of my thesis advisors. Mm-hmm. And again, as a 30-year local guy, when I came to CHDS, my mind was just opened up to all the possibilities. And so I kept wanting to go more national, more international, and on a large scale. And so the comparative governments class, allowing me to look at the UK, look at Australia and other democratic societies and how they apply these strategies, was very helpful. And I'm appreciative of Dr. Morag for allowing me to do that research as well.
A lot of people want to come to CHDS. Some may be intimidated by the lengthy requirements we have for applying. What would you say to someone who's interested in applying but not quite sure, on the fence?
I would say that you better not be on the fence. You better know what you're in for. It was the most difficult, rigorous program I've ever participated in, but it's been absolutely the most rewarding program I've ever been engaged in as well.
Tom, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you very much for your time.
All right.